In this video, I'll be diving a little deeper into text scaling and legibility, so let's go ahead and get started. As I've mentioned in my article, Text Scaling and Legibility in XR, traditional font sizes that are used in 2D screen UI elements are too small to be easily legible in XR environments when they're in the comfortable viewing distance of 2 to 3 meters. Also, since the resolution of the current devices is too low, you end up with this screen door effect, which makes finer details such as text and scratches on materials much harder to see, especially at smaller sizes. That means we need to take design best practices from print posters and signage as guidance for font sizes and finer details in virtual environments. So let's quickly take a closer look at the best practices for poster design and signage. A serif is a tiny accent added to each character or letter in a font. And these fonts are great if you want to go for a more classic style, but should be used sparingly in XR applications, or only at larger sizes, since the finer accents and the varied line weights make them harder to read on the lower resolution screens found in most current headsets. Also, those thinner line weights can cause line vibration, which can in turn cause eye strain and headaches. A sans-serif font generally has consistent line weights and none of the tiny accents that you see in serif fonts, and this makes them much easier to read on digital screens found in current headsets. If you're going to use a serif font, try to only use it in headings at larger sizes. Don't use it for normal paragraphs and sentences. Use sans-serif fonts as much as possible, but avoid thin line weights, since these can cause line vibration, which in turn can cause eye strain and headaches. So try to use regular to bold sans-serif fonts where possible, and keep it to 2 font families. And avoid italics, since this makes text harder to read. Bunching letters up too close together, or even too far apart, makes them hard to read, so the white space around each letter is just as important as the letter itself. A good general practice is to keep your leading, or the spacing between the lines, at 3 to 5 points larger than the font size. And color is not just a visual aesthetic, it's also a science. Using the right colors is important to ensure people can read the text in your designs. Too little contrast can make your text illegible, and choosing the wrong color combinations can hurt your eyes. As I've said, color theory is its own science, and you can learn more in the article I've included in the show notes. In order to help people scan your content quickly, you need to have good visual hierarchy in place. Use headings in larger font sizes to separate out your text into sections that are easy for people to scan and get to the content they're looking for. Also, be consistent in those treatments throughout the design. And less is more. The more text and content you put in your design, the harder it will be to scan and read. So keep your text short and simple. Traditional font sizes that you use for computer screens or for printed books are going to be too small to read at further distances, especially the distances needed in XR for comfortable viewing. The text needs to be larger the further away from the viewer it's placed. And you'll want to use less text as the distance increases as well. The further away the image or the text is from the viewer, the less fine detail is needed. If you take a closer look at the detail work done on murals and billboard signage, you might be surprised to find that there's much less detail than you would think. That's because the further away we are from something, the less we're able to make out the details. So in order to compensate for this, printers and artists use bolder blocks of color that will visually blend the further away you are from it, and our brains fill in the rest of the details. This also helps with performance in your XR experience, since the file sizes are going to be smaller for less detailed assets, as long as they're optimized well. I've included links in the show notes for you to learn more about the graphic design best practices for posters and signage, so be sure to check those out. Back in 2018, Dong-Yoon Park, a creative technologist at Microsoft, ran some experiments with the HoloLens to figure out his own best practices for typography. which Microsoft has adopted into their design documentation. He ran multiple experiments on sizing, placement, different fonts, and even diverse languages. If you have access to a HoloLens, I highly encourage you to check it out for yourselves. I've included the link below in the show notes. If you don't have access to a HoloLens, you can check out his videos and his blog article, which I've also included in the show notes. So for a quick recap, for information and UI panels, use 2D fonts placed in 3D space. Don't use extruded 3D type for important information since this can reduce legibility. 3D fonts can be used if they're more for stylistic effects in the environment, but should not be used for important information. Limit your font families to 2 or less, preferably sans-serif fonts, since they have uniform lines and don't have the finer accent details that serif fonts have. Keep accessibility in mind and make sure you have good, balanced color contrast between your text and your background. Keep the resolution of the target headsets in mind when choosing minimum font sizes. Continue following graphic design best practices for typography. Don't use thin font weights or small font sizes, since this can cause line vibration due to the lower resolutions of current headsets. It's also important to remember that these guidelines will change as the technology advances. Resolutions will increase, and the lenses will be able to digitally correct depth of field more effectively.
Quality base here. The Eagle has